Hello, this is Mr. Fredericks, and today we're going to do a screencast on the Red Scare of 1919 to 1920. So let's get to it. So we're talking about the first Red Scare. Now, if you're a student of U.S. history, there are two major Red Scares. The first one occurs right after World War I in 1919-1920. Now, that said, the second one, and arguably the larger, more impactful one, occurred right after World War II in 1945, pretty much all the way up to maybe the 1953. Now, that said, we're going to focus on the first one in 1919. So this one is going to be characterized by basically fear and paranoia. And so people are going to be freaking out all across the United States. They're going to be seeing really communist ghosts everywhere. And of course, if you study history, you know the communist color of choice is red, all across, internationally speaking. So that's where the red comes in. And of course, the final aspect of the Red Scare is the government's response to it, society's response, which is going to lead to a show of strength and some would argue oppression and maybe even a violation of freedom of those that would be accused of possibly being communist. So that said, let's go for a little more formal definition. The first Red Scare was a period during the early 20th century of the United States marked by widespread fear of Bolshevism and anarchism due to real and imagined events. So, Bolshevism is a fancy word for communism, and anarchism is a term that means the belief that government is oppressive and therefore should be disbanded and eliminated. So we'll get a little more in depth with that. But so the Red Scare was a time of fear towards communism and anarchism. So let's look at why this happened in 1919. So we get a couple causes. Number one of the early triggers was Russia got conquered in 1917 in the middle of World War One. Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks, later named communists, are going to have a revolution. And they're going to take over Russia and even knock it out of World War One. Now, Russia is taken over, turns communist, and Russia is a huge country. This is going to lead to paranoia that this evil thing called communism is now controlling the largest country on earth, significantly larger than the US, and the US is pretty large. So that powerful new country is going to inspire fear in many Americans. And that's fear of attack and fear of a rival and a nation that's larger than you. That can lead to some fear. So the second reason why people got all paranoid during the Red Scare was one, they now had a new dangerous enemy in Russia, but they also felt vulnerable to the Russian leaders, the Bolsheviks. Now, the communists were super strong, or at least apparently so. If they can take over Russia, which is this huge country, I think it's like 13 time zones. The U.S. is so much smaller, they can certainly take over the U.S. If Russia can fall, we can fall. And that's kind of what we were thinking. This had just happened in 1917, and here we are in 1919 thinking, wow, they're coming for us. They're going to sneak in. They're going to take us over. So people were paranoid. The causes of the Red Scare: fear of this new Russian communist enemy, fear of a Bolshevik invasion, fear of losing our wealth through revolution. That's another cause. So Americans were paranoid in 1919. If you study the theory of communism, Karl Marx's theory, he came up with it in 1847, Karl Marx, and in his manifesto known as the Communist Manifesto, his idea was that as the world industrialized, there was more and more inequity, and that meant that a few rich people owned just about everything. And slowly the workers of the world, particularly the industrial workers, would realize that their lives are terrible, but that they outnumber the rich people, and that these poor people across the world, now keep in mind this wasn't about Russia, it was about the whole world. These poor people would unite together because they drastically outnumbered the wealthy and the entrepreneurs and the upper middle class, and they would have this revolution, and it wouldn't be peaceful. It would be violent, and all these people coming together in solidarity would have power, and they would take over, and they would eliminate the capitalists, the entrepreneurs, the bourgeoisie, and they'd be successful, and they would force equality upon the world, or at least liberate people to become equal. Now, what does that mean? Capitalists, business owners, people with money would lose their money, their homes, all their toys, and that would all be redistributed to create an equal world and society. Capitalists were absolutely not happy about this. They were so worried that communism was going to spread, they would have a revolution in their country, the communists would take over, and that they would lose everything. So they all thought Lenin was behind everything, Bolshevik spies, and that communists and Bolsheviks were going to sneak into the country like this guy, with his Bolshevik knife and ignite thoughts of anarchism and taking out our capitalist government. So yeah, again, the causes of the Red Scare was Russia was conquered, dangerous enemy. The U.S. was vulnerable to also being conquered and taken over by Bolsheviks, that this revolution was going to occur. And another reason, Americans associated communism with, the answer would be unions. In 1919, there was an endless number of strikes. Strikes were somewhat kept at bay during World War I, but now that World War I was over, all these groups of people were saying these companies got rich off of World War I, but those riches were not shared with the employees. The employees started to strike, and strikes made people think of communism. Now, maybe the most famous example of a strike was Seattle. Now, on January 21st, 1919, the shipyard workers, the longshoremen, were angry. Their wages were terrible, so they called a strike, and they all stopped working. Now, hundreds of other unions empathized and fell with them, and they actually joined in the strike in solidarity. They said, we're not going to work until they get what they need and want. Now, that's 60,000 workers all at once saying in Seattle, I am not going to work. So here they are striking and not working. Now, it completely shut down the city. You've had unsuccessful strikes. This was successful. With all these people not working, nothing happened. The cities were empty. Stores closed because they were supporting the union. You couldn't buy milk. Trash didn't get picked up. Basically, the society shut down. Transportation, you couldn't get around. Schools closed. The teachers weren't teaching. The unions, these workers, had taken over the city. And if you were a capitalist across the country, you thought this was the most selfish thing. How dare they do this? So again, why was this such a big idea? Well, Americans were scared. They basically thought these strikes, and there were thousands of them, Seattle was just one, that these strikes were just the beginning. They were the first step towards the poor people, the workers of the world, the industrial workers, all getting together in violent revolution. They outnumbered the wealthy, they outnumbered the bourgeoisie, the capitalists, and they felt like if this turned violent, the people running the strikes might take over the government, the country, and then might take all of their stuff. So they believed this was the first step towards Karl Marx's revolution, the first step towards what happened in Russia happening in the US. So again, Seattle wasn't alone. There was clear evidence. And of course, newspapers started publishing things like this pamphlet, Russia's behind the strike. They're the ones doing it. Lenin ordered it. So again, all those headlines, this is Marxism. This is America, not Russia. How dare they strike? War is coming. So once again, they didn't see strikes as an attempt by labor to get a fair deal or fair wages. They saw it as the first step towards communism taking over. So again, the time has come for the people of Seattle to show their Americanism. So if you were striking, you weren't actually a true American. You were a communist, a Bolshevik, as if strikes were that bad. But that said, strike workers are agents of Lenin. This was the mentality of people across America. So by 1919, many people in America were absolutely paranoid. Russia got taken over. The Bolsheviks were sneaking into this country. We could be taken over. And strikes were happening, showing that the Bolsheviks were taking over. Now, causes of the Red Scare, why we were so paranoid of communism? Well, again, Russia was a new enemy. The Bolshevik Revolution could be spread here. And, of course, these strikes were proving it. Now, suddenly, another huge push. 30 very important members of American society were all sent a what in the mail? Difficult question. The answer is going to be number 2. They were sent a bomb. In 1919, bombs were sent to all these important Americans, as if all Americans aren't important. But like John Rockefeller, super wealthy, J.P. Morgan, those robber barons, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, he got a bomb sent to him, and 27 others. Now, the United States started getting paranoid. If these people can be attacked, anybody can be attacked. So were these attacks successful, these bombs being sent to them? Well, the first bomb showed up in Atlanta, and it was sent to an ex-senator that was pretty harsh on immigrants. Now, this ex-senator received a package, and his wife said, oh, God, it looks like the doorbell's ringing. So she tells the maid, hey, I've got a bunch of pencils that are supposed to be delivered. Can you go get it? So the maid goes and gets it and opens the package, and that, of course, triggers the explosion. Boom. And she didn't die, but she lost her hands. Now, that afternoon, all the rest of the packages went out to all the other 30 people, right? So the next day, a guy named Charles Kaplan is riding home on the subway, and he's reading the newspaper, and he hears about the maid with her hands blown up, and he's like, reads about the description of the package, and he's thinking, wow, I just came from the post office, and there were a bunch of these, packages where I worked. And so he says, you know what? I got to go check on this. So he goes all the way back to work, and he finds 16 packages that match the description of the ones that were sent to that ex-senator's house. And they all had the same from Gimbel Brothers. So now he's convinced. So he calls the police. And now, luckily, these packages had not been mailed yet. They actually had insufficient postage. So whoever tried to mail them didn't put enough stamps on them. Talk about kind of a tough way for your plan to be foiled. The police were called, and they stopped these bombs. They destroyed them before they could be sent and blown up. Now, even though these were stopped, you would think the problem's solved, but it's not, because everybody's wondering who's behind it, who did it. It's nothing worse than a criminal that's not caught. Everybody thinks everybody's the criminal then. Now, there was a clue. Now, the bombs were sent to be delivered on May Day, essentially May 1st. Now, this is the famous day that came about because of the Haymarket Square riots and all the violence that occurred. May Day is the international day to support laborers and socialists and communists. So clearly the socialists are behind this, the communists are behind this. Now, again, we just talked about this. It was that May Day came about because it was the very beginning of May when those union protesters and anarchists were attacked by the police and shot, and many of them even killed. They were then put on trial, and many of them were executed. So again, this is the International Martyr Day for socialists and so on. So the communists were indeed blamed for these packages, and maybe they were even behind it. But then it got worse. June 1919, there was a second round of bombings. And then 1 month later, a person carrying 20 pounds of dynamite blew up in front of what very important person's house? And the answer is going to be number 5, A. Mitchell Palmer. Now, A. Mitchell Palmer was important because he was President Wilson's what? And the answer is his attorney general, which is like him being his top cop. Now, just remember, presidents aren't experts on everything, so they have departments, and one of those departments is the Justice Department, and the attorney general runs that department. A. Mitchell Palmer was Wilson's top cop or attorney general, and on June 1st, 1919, this man, Carlo Veldinelsi, I just botched that last name. Clearly, I need to work on that. But either way, he shows up. He's got this suit on with these pinstripes. He's got a bow tie on. He shows up at A. Mitchell Palmer's house with dynamite strapped to his chest. He knocks on the door. Next thing, he accidentally falls off the stairs somehow, and somebody hears a big bang, and then boom, it triggers the bomb. So nobody even came to the door. So the bomber kind of screwed up a little bit. Only he died, but the house was kind of destroyed, or at least the front of it was. A. Mitchell Palmer is not necessarily the right person to mess with. He has the power of the government, the Justice Department behind him. So either way, as Attorney General, he immediately orders the organization that later would become the FBI to go after the people that are wrong. So what happens? The man who had been carrying the flyer the person who blew up, and it said, "Down with tyranny, the anarchist fighters." And part of that flyer said, "We have been dreaming of freedom, and you have jailed us and clubbed us and deported us. You've murdered us." So part of his scalp was found on the roof of his house, A. Mitchell Palmer's house. They examined it, and immediately they found out that it had traces from somebody who was Italian. So now they knew that the anarchists are the enemy. They're the ones behind the bombings, most likely, and that's going to freak everybody out because they're going to start pointing fingers. Are you an anarchist? Are you an anarchist? And of course, the Italians and immigrants are going to get the brunt of that blame because people are going to be afraid of them. So Russia now was a communist leader. The Bolshevik Revolution occurred and could spread. People were worried that Bolsheviks in the U.S. were going to spread. We're going to take over the U.S. Strikes were happening, so it looked like that was true. Bombs were sent, 2 waves of them. A. Mitchell Palmer's house blew up. And the 6th reason why the Red Scare occurred was there was this massive amount of nativism and extreme patriotism at this time in America. Now, during World War I, it triggered a lot of patriotism, and patriotism usually is looked at as a good thing. But I would argue that when you are absolutely high on patriotism, you're basically willing to provide unconditional support to whoever you're supporting, like your country. And that type of nationalism and/or patriotism can be dangerous because when you offer unconditional support, you're willing to do anything to support your country, no matter what mistakes your country might make. So the Espionage and Sedition Act took away the rights of the people even to disagree with their government about the war. Freedom of speech was destroyed. Thousands were arrested, yet people still were blinded by their patriotism. Now, the other aspect of extreme patriotism is the rise of nativism. Now, the reason for that is that if you are going to support your nation, your country, you have to define what is your country and who is it. And if you're defining your country one way, that's going to exclude everybody else. They become the enemy or inferior. And so World War I is going to create patriotism that leads to nativism. America's number one, which means everybody else is a far number two and a threat to us. And that's going to create fear of immigrants and anybody who doesn't seem American enough. And that type of nativism is going to prime the United States to be ready for the Red Scare. Because when you hate others because they're not part of your team that you love, that hate can lead to fear because we fear our enemies and those we identified as enemies. So there's all these rumors that led to the Red Scare, but the final one was rumors about May 1st. Now remember, we talked about May 1st being the International Day for Laborers or Socialists or Communists. And A. Mitchell Palmer is going to say, as well as a lot of other politicians, that May 1st is the day when all the secret Bolsheviks and all the immigrants are going to rise up and try to take over our country through violent revolution. It's going to happen on May 1st. I know it. And that fear is just going to multiply and everybody's going to be worried and they're going to see enemies everywhere. All those political speeches, particularly by A. Mitchell Palmer, is going to lead to fear. And of course, that fear is going to justify the government taking some pretty extreme actions to control the enemy that's out there. And even if there wasn't a real enemy, but A. Mitchell Palmer doing those speeches, making everybody scared of that enemy, is going to allow the government to make some really questionable decisions during the Red Scare. So what were the origins of the Red Scare? The Russian Revolution. Russia was out there as a new enemy. America was vulnerable to that same revolution of the Bolsheviks. Lenin claimed a world revolution was going to happen. It was going to spread everywhere, including the US. There were thousands of strikes, so it seemed like Lenin was right. The 1919 bombings basically showed that the revolution was starting to happen. And this extreme patriotism and nativism is going to make things ripe to have prejudice against people that were different, particularly immigrants and anarchists and communists and socialists. So Americans were scared for all those reasons. And when people are afraid, they need somebody to blame. It's just a human instinct. So in 1919, who did America blame for all these bombings? And the answer is going to be anarchists and communists. So what did A. Mitchell Palmer do to protect America? And the answer is a lot of things. So we just talked about what caused the Red Scare. Now we're going to talk about what we did about it, what the United States, how we reacted. So example number one, freedom of speech was gone. And for example, in 1919, in the state of Connecticut, I believe, Connecticut, this gentleman, Joseph, is going to try to turn in a Liberty Bond. And what does he do? He goes into a department store and he gets into a fight with somebody running a cash register there. He basically said, "Why do you hate Lenin? He's the most brainiest man ever." The guy called the police on the guy and he ended up getting arrested under the Sedition Act. Basically, under the Sedition Act, not allowing to speak out against the American government or the American war, and clearly saying something nice about a communist was violating the Sedition Act. So he went to jail. So that's just an example, one example of people couldn't even say they liked somebody around the world without getting thrown in jail or prison. So basically, you had to watch your mouth, stay silent, or risk being in prison during the Red Scare. Freedom of speech is dangerous. You say ideas that aren't good for the country, those can spread. Example number two of how we reacted, immigrants were bullied. In 1919, during May Day, in the state of New York, the Russia's People House, kind of an immigrant house, Americans are going to storm into it, and they burned all the documents down. Then they grabbed all the people working there, pulled them out to the street, and forced them to sing the Star-Spangled Banner. So, this is clearly assault and battery. This is a lot of things, yet that's what was allowed to happen. Police didn't stop it. So this was immigrants were bullied and harassed and assaulted and beat up. Example number 3, parades were attacked. Again, in 1919, May Day parades where people would march for socialism, for the rights of workers, to better workers. And the marches happened in Boston and Detroit and Cleveland, and they were all peaceful parades. But under the Red Scare, these groups were looked at as potentially evil and terrible and might be trying to take over the US. So Americans, a group of Americans, attacked each of the parades. They got into street brawls attacking these people. Particularly in Boston, the mob kept going after beating up those peaceful protesters, or should I say marchers. They go to the socialist headquarters in the city and they just attack and beat up everybody working there. And thank God the police showed up, and of course, who they arrest? Not a single one of the people that beat up the marchers or the people in the building. They beat up all of the socialists. 116 of them got arrested. That's how fearful our society was. A group of people can get attacked and they themselves are the one who get arrested. So total police abuse, but justified by fear. Now, so how did we react? We suppressed freedom of speech. Immigrants were bullied, buildings were attacked, parades were attacked, but also freedom of assembly, a right from the First Amendment, gone. So let's look at all the violence caused by the socialists. Now, in reality, it was other Americans attacking the socialists, but this violence was blamed on these socialist parades. So the socialist parades were banned. Many states actually passed laws saying socialists could not get together to create parades because they led to violence, even though they weren't the ones that started the violence. So socialists lost their First Amendment rights. They could not assemble. The reason that is so important: when you believe in an idea, one person really can't push that idea or cause positive change. So it's only through getting groups together that we can create positive change and fight tyranny and oppression. However, you can't make those changes if you can't bring people together. So the First Amendment allows everybody to assemble. However, since those people assembling led to violence, even if it wasn't their fault, it was restricted from them. Many would argue that today, or I would argue today, that the Constitution was destroyed by this lack of the right to assemble for socialists. So another way that the Red Scare, the government responded and society responded: freedom of expression, which is a type of freedom of speech, again guarded by the First Amendment. Communist flags, which typically have that red color in common, representing the worker or socialism. It's the international color. So during the Red Scare, we were such paranoid that 24 states out of 50, or at that time 48, banned having the socialist flags. You could not fly that flag. Talk about no freedom of speech, no freedom of expression. So many Americans were so fearful that we wouldn't want those ideas to spread, and we allowed the First Amendment to be obstructed. So many states also passed height restrictions that even if you fly a flag of socialism, the US flag has to be higher. And that etiquette and those laws still are present today. So freedom of expression, gone. So Constitution, again, First Amendment being burned. So what's another example of oppression under the Red Scare? The Palmer raids. This is the most famous example. Basically, A. Mitchell Palmer, Attorney General of the Justice Department under Wilson, and basically the head of what would become the FBI, it wasn't called that yet, basically said, hey, I support many political parties, but not the Socialist Party and not the Anarchist Party. So A. Mitchell Palmer is out there looking for bad guys. So he wants to go after the anarchists and after the socialists. So what did he do? He needed to find who were members of the Socialist Party. So so how did he get that information? He raided magazines. Basically, if you were a magazine place, a publisher with a printing press, he raided those stores, those companies, and basically found out who they were sending their magazine to. So therefore, our government had lists of the thousands of people that were socialists and anarchists. So again, got their names, their addresses, because the magazines were sent there. And illegal wiretaps were set up. So without any evidence of wrongdoing, listening to these people, watching these people, violating, of course, their rights to privacy under the Fourth Amendment. So just boom, just another example of how when fear happens, our government responds to the fear with violating rights in the name of security. So the Fourth Amendment just trashed with all these kind of illegal wiretaps, etc. Now, what did Palmer use all this information he gathered? Well, during the night, he would raid with his police from the Justice Department. He would beat up these socialists and these anarchists. He'd lock them in jail. He had no evidence to lock them away, but did anyway. No, didn't charge them. We all have the right to a trial. Under the Sixth and Seventh Amendment, there was no judge. They were locked in prison, or jail, I should say. Now, these raids are going to absolutely violate due process of Americans. That's the Fifth Amendment, that's the 14th Amendment. People weren't charged with any crimes or given trials to prove that they were innocent. They were just locked away. And Americans didn't care because America was so afraid of them. So kind of the lesson of that is, in times of great fear, often the government will take extreme approaches to protect people, and that will often lead to the violation of rights, particularly of unpopular groups at the time. And the US has a long history of labeling certain groups as unpopular. So we have to be really careful during heightened times of patriotism and times of fear, particularly times of war, because rights often get violated. Now, the places with most people arrested during the Palmer raids were number 5, Brockton, Bridgewater, Lawrence, and Lowell, places around Massachusetts. There was just a high level of Italian immigration in Massachusetts at the time to these industrial towns that they're the ones who are going to experience the most Palmer raids and violation of rights. Now, example number 7 of how the Red Scare manifested: deportations. 249 were arrested in these Palmer raids, and on December 21st, 1919, they were taken from their cells and put on the USS Beaufort. They weren't even allowed to carry what they could carry, basically just thrown on a ship, and the USS Beaufort was instructed to bring them back to Russia. And that's exactly what it did. It was nicknamed the Soviet Ark. Now, they had committed no crimes. There was no evidence. So we don't like the way you think or who you associate with. You're an immigrant, and we fear and despise you at this time out of nativism, so get out of our country. So this is extremely racist and nativist. Now, why was it called the Soviet Ark as a nickname, the Beaufort? Because it was named after the biblical Noah's Ark, which was sent by God to, Noah was supposed to save civilization, save the world by saving 2 of each species, and then the world was flooded. It's an old biblical story, but Noah's Ark saved the world, and this explains it pretty well. Just as the sailing of the Ark that Noah built was a pledge for the preservation of the human race, so is the sailing of the Ark of the Soviet as a pledge to preservation of America. Let's get rid of these people. So 556 total deportations with no evidence. And again, very kind of un-American people, not charged of any crimes, with very little evidence or no evidence, kicked out of the country. How did the Red Scare manifest? Besides freedom of speech being suppressed, immigrants being bullied, attacked, parades attacked, freedom of assembly being denied to socialist flags being banned, Palmer raids where people's rights and people were beat up and locked away without evidence, deportations. Example number 8, democracy was destroyed. So basically in New York, the New York State Assembly, their version of Congress, had a vote. The New York people voted, and they voted in 5 socialists. A lot of people supported socialism, and 5 socialists were voted in to be in New York's Congress, their assembly. And those 5 people were supposed to sit and, be little New York congressmen. And what happened during the Red Scare, we were so scared that on April 1st, before they could ever take part, by a vote of 140 to 6, the New York Assembly kicked them out, said, we're expelling you. You don't have the right to be in government, which is a total destruction of democracy at that time. The Red Scare just, compromised what people thought. And the people's votes did not matter. So this is a lot of violation of rights under the Red Scare. Once again, when people are scared in the name of national security, our society has always been willing to take extreme decisions to protect people in the violation of rights of unpopular people. We got to be careful of that. So this was the world that Zachel and Vanzetti lived in, and they're going to be our next example of kind of how the Red Scare manifested into nativism. Now they're going to get into trouble, Zachel and Vanzetti. So I'm going to tell their story. Now there's this guy named Vanzetti. He lived in Italy. And of course, Zachel lived in Italy. And in 1908, they traveled to the United States, migrated. Now, as time went by, Zachel found a home in Massachusetts, and Vanzetti found a home in Plymouth. Now, so one's in Stoughton and one's in Plymouth, so really close to Braintree. Now that said, we know where they lived, but what did they do for work? Vanzetti got a job as a fish peddler. Zachel got a job in a shoe factory. Now, as the years went by, they became angry. They were working themselves to death an endless number of hours, but had no money. Clearly, capitalism was awful. Society was unfair. The rich exploited the poor, and the government supported the rich and didn't allow the poor to fight back. The government basically stopped strikes from happening. So the government supported the rich and allowed them to exploit the poor. So because of this anger, what political philosophy did Zachel and Vanzetti adopt and subscribe to? Like a lot of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, they supported anarchism for these reasons, which is that anarchism is the philosophy that they're against government. Now, why do they hate government? And again, the reason is, number one, government passes laws, and every one of those laws obstructs freedom. Number two, government just protects who? Well, certainly in the early 1900s, it protected the wealthy, the rich, and businesses. And that is a problem for all those that work for those groups. Every time the workers of America try to fight for their rights by striking, pushing back, the government would come in and break up the strikes and pass laws preventing strikes from happening. So here's a quote from an anarchist: "No governments could possibly serve humanity. Instead, governments watched over, inspected, spied on, directed, regulated, preached at, and controlled the people." And certainly the Palmer raids are evidence of this. Abolish government and men would be free. So that's kind of that anarchist philosophy. Now, the third thing, in 1917, World War I occurred, and in the U.S. was going to go to war against Germany, but we didn't have enough soldiers, so America was drafting or forcing Americans to fight, and even immigrants. If you refused, as Zachel and Vanzetti did, you could be thrown in prison. And that made them angry. How dare their freedom be taken away from them? This wasn't their war. They shouldn't have to fight. So they thought this was a free country. What's going on? So Zachel and Vanzetti, along with hundreds of anarchists, fled to Mexico. They went down to Mexico during World War I, and 2 years later, the war's over, and they come back home. Now, the anarchists come home, but they're so unbelievably angry. Why? Because they had to leave their families. They had to go to Mexico for 2 years. Now, that's a pretty big deal when you can't be around your children or loved ones. And that's all because the U.S. threatened to throw them in jail for not fighting. Reason number two, those that didn't flee to Mexico actually got arrested and thrown in prison and lost their freedom. All because of the Sedition Act. So the Sedition Act, so this kind of brings us to 1920. And this is our famous example of kind of what was going on during the Red Scare and what the consequences are. According to anarchists, government is the enemy. They just attacked and imprisoned and beat up workers and anybody who was against the war. And according to the government, the anarchists are the enemy because many of the anarchists fought back with violence. So under the Red Scare, Zachel and Vanzetti were the perfect targets for people that were afraid. And make no mistake, Zachel and Vanzetti were not angels. At all. There was some evidence linking them to people that had sent the bombs during the Red Scare in 1919. So they possibly even had something to do with it, but we will never know. But they were good friends with those involved, so that that made them guilty in some people's heads. But either way, we have some journal entries, and Zachel and Vanzetti were down on paper saying revolution is necessary, peaceful if possible, violent if necessary. So we know that they were willing to commit acts of violence. Violence is the righteous retaliation against those who jailed, deported, and killed their comrades on the picket line. So again, they have expressed that violence is acceptable. So maybe they aren't exactly the nicest people in the world, but that doesn't mean they're guilty about what's about to happen. So let's tell their story. Our story begins that on April 15th, 1920, in the town of Braintree, Massachusetts, which is located right there, and now on the street called Pearl Street. Today, you can look, there's a supermarket there, post office, a Burger King near Tennessee Barbecue. Well, anyway, that's on Pearl Street at 3 p.m. Frederick Parmenter, I can't pronounce anybody's names, but Frederick anyway, he has $15,000+ and it's payday. He has to pay the people at his shoe factory. Now, he's at his office. He's got to go to the factory where they're working to hand out money. It's a half-mile away. His car turns out not to have much gas. So he says, I'm going to walk it. It's a nice day. So he walks it with $15,000, always a smart idea. And this car pulls up quickly and shoots and kills the person with the money and the person they were walking with. Now, this is deemed murder. Now, Zachel and Vanzetti are going to be arrested a few days later for this crime, but also another robbery. So either way, there's going to be a trial, and at that trial, it's going to erupt across the world that this is the most unfair trial ever, that these two were only arrested because of prejudice in the United States. There are going to be protests in hundreds of cities all across the world because of this Braintree crime. It's really Braintree's claim to fame, possibly. So people are going to see this as symbolic, as representative of all the racism and nativism and the consequences of extreme prejudice coming out of the Red Scare. So the whole world is going to protest, say, free Zachel and Vanzetti, free them. But ultimately, they went through 2 trials. They lost the first one. They got an appeal. They got a second one. They were found guilty again, and they were executed. Now, maybe they were guilty, maybe not. Maybe one of them was guilty, maybe not. We won't know. But some feel that they were arrested, convicted, and executed not because of evidence. There was some of that, but they were arrested because they were anarchists for their political beliefs, which is a total violation of the First Amendment. They were arrested because they were Italians, and there was prejudice against immigrants. They were arrested because the Red Scare made people intolerant to people that were different from them. So Zachel and Vanzetti's story we're going to look more into, but most importantly, you should now have a good knowledge of the Red Scare and how it impacted American behavior and how we need to be fearful of fear itself. So let's look for our assignment on Google Classroom as related to the Red Scare. Enjoy your day.